Hi, I'm Fox with FoxeoGames, and this is Bioshock Infinite for the PC, also available on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Originally released in 2013 to critical acclaim, does Bioshock Infinite still hold up as a worthwhile experience years later? Let's find out. As always, let's begin with the PC port. Bioshock Infinite breaks the mold for the Bioshock series when it comes to the PC port, and that's a very good thing. Options include full screen, windowed, or borderless windowed, aspect ratio, resolutions up to at least my max in 1920 by 1080, graphics presets, anti-aliasing on or off, and then various levels for texture detail, texture filtering, dynamic shadows, ambient occlusion, and object detail. There are binary options for post-processing light shafts and VSync, as well as a slider for field of view and brightness. Some general gameplay options are also here, including highlighted searchable and important objects. This is a pretty solid list of graphics options, although VSync is mildly disguised under the language lock frame rate. My only complaint is the binary anti-aliasing setting, which offers no variety other than on or off. It'd be nice to choose the type and level of AA. Audio options allow you to separately control the master, music, sound effects, and voice volume. Gameplay options allow you to change a few settings, including floating combat text and Steam Cloud support. And speaking of Steam Cloud support, the game only allows you to have one save file, with saves occurring automatically. This is a big step backwards for the series. You can play with either mouse and keyboard or controller, and there is support for extensive key binding. Thankfully, mouse acceleration can be turned off, and you can invert the vertical mouse controls if you're one of those weirdos who likes to push the mouse forward to look down. Performance is stellar, and my system maintained a high frame rate at nearly all times, even with heavy action on the screen. With nearly all settings maxed, I was generally seeing my G-Sync max frame rate of 144 frames per second or close to it. My PC specs can be found in the video description below. My only real complaints here include the limit of one saved game file and the lack of variety in the anti-aliasing options. Graphically, Bioshock Infinite is certainly the best looking of the series, and this is not surprising given that it's the most recently released. It also helps a lot that the game doesn't suffer from limited physics, frame rate, or lack of graphics settings like the previous two titles. The entire game has a sort of sepia tone to it. Everything tends toward these orangish, brownish colors. It's hard for me to describe, but it's easy to see from the footage. The sky, clouds, character models, objects, weapons, buildings, and airships all look great. The textures, however, are a mixed bag, although most feature decent resolution, at least at ultra settings. Notice that I said most. Unfortunately, some textures do lack the higher resolution that modern PCs are more than capable of handling, and some of the less important textures, like the vendor fruit, are downright hideous. Fortunately, these textures aren't front and center and exist only on some background decoration. This was clearly a sacrifice made for the console versions of the game to help with performance. As mentioned earlier, the physics are not locked to 30 FPS, so the animations and movement of characters and objects in the game look as good as they should, and you can take full visual advantage of high frame rates. The special effects from Vigors look solid, but don't feel as impressive as I thought they would. Weapon fire is great, and you can see the fire and smoke erupt from the firearms. And speaking of smoke effects, they make great use of it here. Whether it's intended to be smoke, clouds, or a combination of the two, it looks great. Water in the game is okay, but you don't see a lot of it. Lighting, on the other hand, leaves me scratching my head. I feel like they backtracked in this area, as many light sources seem dull and lifeless, leaving many areas of the game too dark to see anything. There are numerous corners or ends of hallways that simply lose nearly all detail in the darkness, and some light sources are so bright that it's hard to see what's around them. Shadows look decent, but I can't seem to find any instance in which the protagonist casts a shadow, which was a nice touch in Bioshock 2. It seems wholly absent here, unless I somehow missed it. The game has an undeniably prominent aesthetic that sets it apart from most other first-person shooters. The clothing, buildings, and interior design all look like they're taken out of an older novel like The Great Gatsby. Typewriters, old-style newspapers, and mid-20th century uniform designs all set a consistent tone. The weapons follow suit, looking like something you might have seen in World War II. The pistol is likely modeled after the German Mauser C96, commonly used during World War II. Unlike the previous two games, both the aesthetic of the visuals and the technical side of the graphics come together to make a cohesive whole that both looks and performs wonderfully. Bioshock Infinite once again impresses in the sound and music department. Sound engineering is great, with incredible visceral and powerful effects for weapons, vigors, and other various sounds. There is one issue which I'll address in a moment. The music doesn't really stand alone, but it does complement the game's various scenes quite nicely, creating many tense and riveting scenes as well as matching equally somber or more low-key moments.
When you were unconscious on the beach, you kept repeating a woman's name. Anna.
I don't want to talk about that.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried.
The voice work in Infinite is spectacular. I have zero complaints other than the issue I alluded to earlier. Unfortunately, just like the previous Bioshock games, voices of enemies and other characters in the game basically sound exactly the same regardless of how close or far away they are. You'll hear enemies taunting you from what sounds like right next to you, when in reality they are deep in the next room, possibly further away. The voices don't seem to get quieter or louder based on distance, and voices behind me sounded the same as voices in front of me. I was playing the game in stereo sound mode. As for story, Bioshock Infinite feels like the most unique of the three games. Breaking with the mold of the underwater city of Rapture, we're now in a floating city in the sky called Columbia. In contrast to the previous Bioshock games, the political and social issues of Columbia aren't just a background to the action but take center stage. There are more segments of extended exposition and a lot more characters with unique personalities who play important roles in the plot. From time to time, you'll see various characters in disputes and even battles with each other. You can occasionally choose whether or not to engage certain NPCs in combat, as they will be neutral to the protagonist, at least initially. There are a few decisions to be made throughout the game, which are generally presented as either-or options. The exposition still occurs during audio logs called voxophones, but also plays in a video format in the way of kinetoscopes. These are all optional bits of story, but like last time, some exposition occurs during interaction with characters, and this time around there's a lot more of it. I also didn't see a way to skip these moments, as they are integrated into the game pretty tightly. As the story progresses, you learn bits and pieces of what's going on, who you are, and who the other characters are in relation to you. I can't say much without spoiling anything, but there is a ton of story exposition packed into the last few moments of the game. Like the story, the gameplay in Bioshock Infinite is uniquely different from the previous two titles. You still have plasmids and firearms. The plasmid, now called a Vigor, is in your left hand and the gun is in your right. However, your melee weapon is always bound to a separate button. It is not equipped as your primary weapon. So, you essentially always have one Vigor, one firearm, and your melee weapon available for use at all times. You can upgrade your weapons and vigors. Weapon upgrades are purchased and include larger magazine sizes, which the game incorrectly refers to as clip size, additional damage, and better accuracy. Vigor upgrades are also purchased and include more interesting options, such as a cluster bomb effect added to your fire vigor, or adding additional splash effects to other vigors. Unlike previous games, each vigor now has two modes of use, the standard attack and then a trap mode, where you essentially lay down the vigor power for enemies to stumble into. Some of the vigors mimic those you've already seen, like the standard lightning attack, and others are unique to Bioshock Infinite. Some major changes have come to Bioshock this time around. Infinite now features an auto-recharging shield, and you are limited to only being able to carry 2 firearms at a time. You can also upgrade Booker, the player character. You will occasionally find upgrade bottles, many of which are well hidden. These bottles allow you to increase your health, recharging shield, or salt, the resource consumed when you use your vigors. Remember, plasmids and Eve are gone, replaced by vigors and salt. They are of course essentially the same thing from a gameplay standpoint. Additionally, upgrades come in the form of clothing that Booker wears, each giving a different unique effect. The more you explore, the more clothing you'll find, and it'll be up to you what you choose to wear. Another huge addition to the game is the integration of the floating city into the gameplay. I was always disappointed by the previous 2 Bioshocks failing to really make use of the ocean, other than 2 featuring a few dull, limited treks through the water. Bioshock Infinite takes full advantage of its setting by including zip lines. Using your melee weapon, you're able to magnetize to these metal zip lines and travel from platform to platform, or even jump from hook to hook, as if it's a grappling hook from other games. You have a large degree of control over your zipline adventures, as the game allows you to speed up, slow down, change directions, jump off, attack with your firearm, and even do a jump attack when you dismount onto an enemy. The game uses these ziplines for some pretty intense moments, and I think they fit perfectly into the game world, as long as you exercise a little suspension of disbelief. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Elizabeth, arguably the star of the game.
It's locked.
Child's play. Done.
While you cannot play as Elizabeth or directly control her character, she functions as an aid to Booker, both in and out of combat. Outside of combat, she can find money and other items that Booker cannot locate, as well as pick locks and occasionally open up other pathways with her special ability. During combat, she frequently throws Booker more ammunition or health and provides rifts that unlock additional combat benefits, such as friendly NPCs to fight with you, stocks of ammunition or health, or structures to use as cover. While it may affect your immersion in the game, Elizabeth is thankfully immune to taking damage and does not need to be defended or healed. Don't worry, Bioshock Infinite is not a giant escort quest. She plays no direct combat role. She never takes up arms and fights enemies, she merely assists Booker from cover.
Watch out, Crow!
The game also features multiple difficulty levels, including an interesting 1999 mode, which is essentially the game's ultimate hard mode. So what's the verdict? Well, Bioshock Infinite is apparently going to be the last in the series, making Bioshock a trilogy. Did it end on a high note, a dud, or something in between? I'm going to go with something in between. For starters, the trip up into the floating city of Columbia is awesome, but I felt it was really unfortunate that you had such a small window from which to view it. It would have been so much better if Booker had been in a pod with at least 180 degrees of window view. After entering the floating city, it feels pretty neat and looks incredible at first. Unfortunately, the introduction to the game greatly overstays its welcome, especially if you're not sure where to go or what to do. You can of course hit a button to generate a navigation arrow, but constantly hitting it is a bit annoying. I found the game took far too long to get to the gameplay, with no combat occurring for up to 30 minutes or more, depending on how much time you spent in the city. Throughout the game, there are lots of nooks and crannies to wander into, but most of the time they have nothing more than ammunition, health packs, and money. A few carry upgrades, but some have virtually nothing at all and feel like time wasters. I found myself constantly struggling with whether or not to explore every little area or just progress through the game. I kept asking myself, do I really need hidden clothing items or upgrades enough to spend the time looking for them? Sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. The game world looks great, but it quickly felt incredibly repetitive and everything started to look the same. I would constantly wander back into rooms I had already been in, not realizing I had gotten myself turned around. This happened more in Infinite than in the previous games. Also, some of the zipline areas made it incredibly difficult to figure out how the world connected, where I had been, and where I was going. I had to rely on the navigation arrow a lot in this game, especially during zipline segments. It's also generally impossible to know which doors will open and which won't. You have to walk right up to them to figure out. Some require you to hit the interact key to open, and some open automatically when you walk into them, while some don't open at all despite looking like they should. And speaking of the interact key, let's talk about the basic key binding. In both previous games, interacting with objects and picking stuff up was done with the E key, which is standard in most modern first-person shooters. Well, this time around they felt the need to remap it to the F key. May I ask why? I ended up rebinding the key to E when I couldn't stop my muscle memory from hitting the E key by mistake. At least now you take everything from a container with one press of the key instead of having to mash the key repeatedly. Oh, and the melee attack, no longer a primary weapon, is mapped to the V key. Again, I'm not sure what they were thinking. The V key is not the most convenient key to hit, particularly for an ability you'll use quite often. I remapped that one too. I had trouble initially figuring out how to change out my vigors and clothing, but eventually I did realize that there's an entire menu available via the O key. I'm sure the game probably told me this at some point, but I guess I missed it and had no idea it existed for a good portion of the game. Also, you have to swap between your two equipped vigors by hitting Q, but reassigning vigors is done by selecting the vigor you want to replace and then hitting one of the number keys. I never knew which vigor was which number, so I just hit all the number keys starting with 1 until I found the vigor I wanted. Infinite was clearly built for the controller, with keyboard controls an afterthought. I've also got to complain about the new save system, or the lack thereof. The game autosaves now with no manual saving option, it simply saves at checkpoints. If you need to stop playing in between the sometimes distant checkpoints, you'll have to start all the way back at the previous checkpoint with all of your progression lost. There are moments where you're certain the game must be autosaving a checkpoint, but it doesn't. For example, I quit the game after leaving from one area to the next and watching a cutscene, confident that that was a checkpoint. It wasn't. And as mentioned, you only have one save file. If you start a new game, you begin overwriting your previous game. Let's address the story. There's no question that there's more of it in this game, with sometimes long-winded segments of exposition. Well, at least long-winded for a first-person shooter. When characters are looking straight at Booker, their eyes can sometimes be quite lifeless, producing that unwanted uncanny valley effect. Exposition aside, the story itself is a big issue for me. I never minded the political issues addressed in the previous games. They fit well into the story and never felt like they went too far. Infinite's quite the opposite. The political and social issues it addresses are front and center, and it's impossible not to feel the heavy-handed, sometimes preachy approach of the game. The ultra-violence of the previous two Bioshocks felt consistent given that you were fighting splicers and other humanoids who had essentially gone crazy, bent on murdering the player. In Infinite, you're fighting mostly regular people, many of whom are working to secure the safety of Colombia. These guys genuinely believe that you're the bad guy, and right or wrong, you are a foreigner coming to take something away from them. The soldiers in the game are given direct orders to stop you, and I'm not sure Booker is entirely justified in gunning them all down, zapping them with lightning, and burning them with fire. This is a stark contrast to the serious, real-life social and political issues the game is trying to address. This just isn't the right format for such heavy topics. I almost hate to say it because it's a bit of a cliche criticism of the game at this point, but the gameplay feels out of step with the exposition. And speaking of gameplay, despite some additional player progression features and added options with vigors, Infinite felt like it went full-on first-person shooter, leaving any resemblance of its spiritual ancestry behind. You can't store resources for later use, such as health packs and salts. You can only carry 2 weapons at a time, you have a recharging shield, you can sprint by holding a key, there's no hacking in the game, you progress level by level, and you encounter numerous scripted exposition segments in which control is taken away from the player. Infinite feels far more like Call of Duty now than it does System Shock, and I think that's a betrayal of the series' roots. Ultimately, despite being impressed by the game during my initial playthrough when it first released, I think that Bioshock Infinite is the most forgettable of the 3 games. It's a throwaway first-person shooter for me. I've noticed many others feel the same. After the game's honeymoon period faded, it received widespread criticism in stark contrast to the initial critical acclaim. Like Dark Souls 2, Bioshock Infinite's flaws and failings become more apparent with time, especially after the novelty of the game has faded away. And sadly, the ending of the game, while clearly trying to be incredibly deep and meaningful, feels ham-fisted and forced. The sheer amount of exposition crammed into the last little bit of the game clearly indicates that the developers didn't know how to pace the story out properly. There are some cool moments at the end, but they don't make up for the confusing paradox it creates. Well, I can't really say anything more for fear I might spoil it for those who haven't finished the game yet. Overall, Bioshock Infinite doesn't really live up to the series standards and is ultimately a title that I think will be long remembered not for everything it did right, but for everything it did wrong. If you love first-person shooters in general, it's definitely worth playing, but as a Bioshock game, it's more than a little disappointing. But what did you think of Bioshock Infinite, and how did it compare to the rest of the series? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please drop a comment down below. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, check the video description for my Twitter, Twitch, Facebook, Let's Play channel, and all that other good stuff. I'm Fox with FoxeoGames, and I'll see you next time.